Welcome back to the Group Practice Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Polaris Healthcare Partners, where we leverage decades of healthcare and business experience to drive growth in successful group practices just like yours. If you're a healthcare entrepreneur and you're interested in building, scaling, or exiting your group practice, you've found not only the industry's leading resource for business education, but a team of trusted advisors dedicated to helping you achieve and exceed your goals. In short, the team at Polaris creates clarity, confidence, and results. I'm your host, Jamie Falasz, and the Group Practice Accelerator podcast is on the air. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for joining me again this week. As you know, we like to bring you education, resources, guests, and topics every week that we can all learn from. And this week isn't any different. In fact, you could say it's kind of a part two of a topic that we started last month, and that's recruiting. You know, we understand that finding and keeping aligned docs in your practices directly impacts the financial and the operational stability of your organization. So we know this is a mission critical topic for just about everybody out there in healthcare practices. We last month had John Fiddler on the show, and he focuses on the executive recruiting side for group practices in healthcare. But we need to get into the part of the organization that sometimes struggles a bit more with recruiting and retention. So today we're going to talk about doctor recruiting. And since you also know that I don't run solo here, I've got a guest who's an expert on today's topic, and that's Morgan Pace, Vice President and Senior Account Executive at ETS Recruit. And because this topic goes hand in hand with partnership, my teammate Mark Flock is here with us as well. Morgan and Mark, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Glad to be back, Jamie.
Good to see you both. Well, why don't we jump into it? Morgan, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first and have you talk to our audience a little bit about what you do and your organization and how you got there.
Sure thing. So I'll give you my quick version, but we go by ETS Dental when we're operating in the dental field, but we're basically a recruiting firm that focuses on private dental offices and specifically in helping them find associate general dentists. And then we also do some dental specialist recruiting as well. But I'm one of six that cover the country doing general dentistry and two that, in addition, that do specialists. But we've been around for over 20 years now. And in that time, we've gotten to know all the dental students and residents and military doctors we can so that we have a big network to pull on to find doctors that fit in with whatever a practice is trying to do. And that's really our sweet spot is helping you identify, what it is you need in a practice, what your strong points are, and then connecting with people that are going to help you continue to grow. And so that's what we do.
Well, that's great. You know, I was looking at your website in preparation for this podcast. I noticed that your degree is in psychology. Did that have anything to do with why you got into this field? And if not, what drew you to this field to begin with?
Sure. Well, it's certainly helpful. And that there's a lot of psychology comes down to motivation and perception. And really that flows well into recruiting. And so I found it to be a helpful tool just to identify, what's really motivating someone. How are they hearing this message? How are they interpreting in that? And then where's the disconnect between what maybe a practice owner thinks and what a potential associate thinks? And being able to bridge that gap is crucial in my success. And I'd say part of the draw to recruiting in general was maybe that psychological aspect. Like I studied down at Virginia Tech years and years ago, so it's been helpful and rewarding as well.
Well, I have so many questions I want to ask there about the psychology of it, but I don't want to go down a rabbit hole yet. So we'll stay on topic at least for now. So we hear a lot of people talk about, gosh, they really struggle to, you know, recruit. I'll just put it into that umbrella. With the current shortage of dental professionals, how can a small group practice owner or even that 3 to 20 range, how can they compete with some of the things that the larger DSOs are offering by like big bonuses for signing on and things like that?
Sure. Well, I think going into it, it's first good to understand what the DSOs are selling. And so by that, I mean, they've got a team of professional recruiters who are in with these dental students or early career doctors early and are always pinging them. And they have the time to do that most practice owners don't. So that's going against them. What they're actually pitching, though, is maybe a little less appealing. And they can cover it up by offering giant signing bonuses or big bonuses. And that's really what they end up doing most of the time, selling the money aspect of it. But they also will sometimes lure early career doctors into locations that they may not want to be by offering them potential to move a little closer to where they'd like to be down the road. And most private practices, of course, can't do that because they have their location and that's it. To boil it down, they can offer more money and they can sound interested because they have a team of people that can do that full time. But what they can't offer, and where a lot of practices could really succeed in the competition here, is in culture and mentoring and access to decision makers. And I can go into more in each of those things, but I feel like that's really what is going to distinguish a really great growing practice from the run of mill DSO job down the road where they've got to bribe them with the big bonuses to get them to look.
Yeah, the money may sound great in the moment, they're coming out of school, they've got a ton of student debt. You've got to think about your longer term game plan. And I think that some of the private group practices really do have a lot to offer. So I think it's wise to look at all of your options. But, that pipeline has changed. The associate pipeline's changed in the last couple of years. What should owners be offering so that they can stay competitive?
Sure. Well, and some of this actually segues well into what Polaris offers, and that I think there's maybe a common misconception that these early career doctors aren't really interested in partnership or ownership anymore, and I don't think that's the case. I think they just don't expect it as quickly. And so what a private practice owner can offer is, one, growth potential. And so that could mean mentoring. That could mean an opportunity to expand their skills, to get more efficient, to really understand how to deal with patients, but also a path moving forward. A group like Polaris that can outline, how partnership would happen, what the triggering events would be, when they could expect that, and really let them understand what was involved in partnership as opposed to it just being sort of a nebulous pay raise down the road. Like that's crucial, and having them see this as a long-term opportunity. And that's again what's going to differentiate them from a DSO office where they see that as just a 1 to 2 year job until they move.
Yeah. And Mark, I'm going to pull you in here. This is right up your alley. So how do you feel that associate pipeline has changed, and maybe some thoughts on how owners can stay competitive as well?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with Morgan. I think a lot of I think associates or doctors that are coming into school are maybe not as quickly getting into ownership, and a lot of the reasons for that is the rise of student loan debt, the rise of the cost of a mortgage for a house, with house prices the way they are, car prices. They're coming out of school with student loan debt. They have, house payments, car payments, credit card debt, student loan debt, and all these things. So it's kind of making it feel daunting for them to also take out $1 million loan and start a practice on their own. And also realizing through the consolidation of, group practices and DSOs that it's becoming more and more difficult to truly own a practice on your own, because of squeezing margins and all that stuff. So I think what I see a lot of doctors, or what I hear a lot of principal owners say is like, hey, I just lost an associate because they wanted partnership and I didn't discuss it with them, or they expected this timeline, I was on this other timeline. I think it's really important to kind of get out in front of that when you're bringing someone on, asking what their expectations are, what that timeline is, kind of come to an agreement and be extremely, extremely proactive in that matter. So the one thing that I usually kind of coach clients on and even present on at a conference is, it kind of has to have like a comprehensive plan of 4 things. And it starts with Morgan and the recruiting side of things is the recruiting of the right individual, obviously, that's aligned with your vision. The onboarding process, what does that look like for you versus maybe a larger chain or group practice or DSO in that case, because that onboarding is extremely crucial in getting them aligned with your values, your culture, your vision, your mission, making sure they're the right fit, and then the development of that individual. I think the smaller practices and groups have an opportunity to develop those doctors, build that rapport, and allow them to want to be owners in that business versus trying to go somewhere else if they do it correctly. And lastly, partnership. It's not made for everyone. Not every doctor wants to be a partner. I see a lot more doctors just wanting to clock in, clock out, and that's great. You got to have those doctors as well. That's beneficial. But the ones that do want partnership, what is your plan? What is that timeline? What is that offering? Whether it's buy-ins or earn-ins or different unique things, I think it's important to have an idea of what you're willing to do, and also understand what that doctor wants so you can marry that all together. So I think that would be kind of my answer there for Jamie on my side and what I see.
Yeah, and you can go back to some of the ADA Health Policy Institute data and look at people do want ownership, but it's not necessarily happening like it used to, 30 years ago or however many years ago, where you went out and just you bought a practice right out of school and even longer than that. But, to your point, people do want ownership. And if they don't, there's still plenty of opportunity for them in a different pathway. And I want to get into a couple of other things that you said about the right candidate that fits your culture. But before we do that, let's talk about, Morgan, some of the mistakes that you see doctors making in hiring their first associate or second associate, or what are you seeing out there?
Sure. And, the doctors we work with, they're just impressive clinicians. They're great business owners, but recruiting doesn't necessarily fall into their wheelhouse. And so there are some common mistakes that hopefully hearing these will help them to kind of re-examine and maybe avoid making them themselves. I would say probably the biggest one I run into is succumbing to the warm body syndrome, where there's so many other distractions and things that these doctors need to stay on top of that it's tempting to just make a quick hire. If someone's interested in the job, they loosely fit the description, they're ready to go, and want to check this one off the list. But I really would encourage doctors to put the time into outlining what it is that the ideal associate looks like. What criteria are you searching for, and if you have the time, then go ahead and wait until you find the right match. Speaking of timing, that's another one where a lot of practice owners don't realize how long it can take to hire a great associate.
Yeah.
And so, let's be optimistic that they're in a great area where they're going to have lots of candidates. It's still usually a 1 to 2 month interview process, a negotiating process before you get a signature. And then that doctor is likely going to have a 60 to more commonly a 90-day notice they're going to have to give. And so that right there is 5 months. And so, if you're not starting early enough, you may be in a situation where your options are hiring a less desirable candidate because you don't have the luxury of being picky at that point, or having the position go open longer, which of course is going to affect the bottom line. So, those are two big ones. I'll add that it's important to know where your position lines up in the market, and that's a little tougher. That's where talking to someone such as myself or maybe Mark can help, and knowing where does your opportunity fit with others in terms of the compensation you're offering, in terms of the appeal. What might you need to do to make it a little more appealing in order to hire that top tier candidate? Because if you're not competitive with the best in the market, then you may have to settle for someone who isn't as ideal a long-term connection.
Yeah, you certainly don't want to be plugging a warm body in there. You really want to have that best cultural fit. Mark, I feel like you have some things to add there too, and especially on and timeline as well.
Yeah, and what I see a lot of times is principal owners or principals, looking to make a hire due to the urgent need because a doctor is putting their notice or have left, but not necessarily considering everything else that should go into that new hire. That's extremely important. And when I say that is this person a good cultural fit? Is this person going to ramp up to the speed that I want them to be at within the first 4 to 6 months? They're just trying to fill a warm body. I heard someone say that earlier, and that's absolutely it. And that's probably the last way you want to look at it, because if you're just filling a warm body, that person's going to turn over again in probably 6 to 18 months, and you're constantly scrambling on that hamster wheel, and you're never actually growing because you're not grabbing a doctor and that doctor's sticking long term. That's way more impactful for your business. And that's also way better for your top line and bottom line revenue, because if you're constantly turning someone over, you're losing revenue to gain a little bit back, then losing revenue to gain a little bit back. You're going through this HR process every single time versus grabbing the right person, even if it takes an extra 30 days. To find that right person that fits in with your culture and is aligned with your values and everything to grow with, it's way more critical. And I think a lot of doctors, you mentioned earlier, just lining up with the right offer. Everyone's talking about their pay rate. Yes, that is absolutely one thing that's important. And it's quite frankly for the associate, I would be looking at it too as an employee. Like, what is my pay rate? Is it 35% of collections? Is it 32% of adjusted production, or whatever that number is, depending on your specialty, depending on your location? But there's so much more that goes into that hire. How much am I going to make in year one? 35% of only 500,000, it's 175,000 or so, versus 30% of $1 million, I can make 300K in this role, because that's what this business is offering me as a new associate. All of our associates do, 800 to $1 million in their first year based on our development plan, based on our onboarding, based on all of our, a lot of different things you can share. And I think that's way more impactful for a doctor coming on board and grabbing that right person. Partnership, it's extremely important. That could be part of that package. This is something we offer. This is what we this is a plan we have in place. We evaluate you for the first 6 to 12 months. If you're a fit and you want to entertain and go into this opportunity, we do X or we do Y. I think that can be very um, sticky for the right individuals. A lot of candidates want that. So if you're coming out of the gate with that, but giving them the timeline, they're more likely to come on board if that's something they want down the road versus saying, "Hey, we'll think about it." And it's like, okay, well, the other doctor that's offering me X is giving me a finite option. You might lose that candidate. So I know it's kind of going around a few things there, but there's a lot of things that go into that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I, just to add to that, I'd say I talked to a lot of doctors who are kind of casually discontent in their current roles, that aren't ready to leave tomorrow or turn in their resignation, but they're starting to look for something better. And I would say most doctors who are in that category are leaving because the pay isn't good enough. That's obviously going to be a factor for some if it's particularly bad, but a lot of it comes down to the culture match, how
Mm.
well the organization is run, how big the staff turnover is, which is a huge issue in a lot of DSOs, and whether they can enjoy their time there. Toxic workplaces are going to drive people away, and these are all areas where, again, frankly, private offices and groups can really excel compared to DSOs, and that's what they should be highlighting as they're going in and making a recruiting pitch.
To your point, Morgan. I mean, that's something. That those are the candidates that you want to try to pull in, and I've always preached this, and I think most people, 99% of people I've talked to, would agree with me. They just don't do it. Is you have to be proactively speaking and talking and recruiting those individuals. You may not have the opportunity today. You might not have the opportunity, 60 days from now, but that opportunity will come up 120 or 180 days from now. And if you have a pipeline of interested people that love the culture that you've built, wants an opportunity to work with you, and you have two candidates on deck, when you have that need, you might be looking 3 months out saying, "Hey, our business is growing fairly quickly. I need to go ahead and get someone in the process." Once again, you mentioned you have to put in maybe a 60 or 90-day notice. You can pull the trigger right then and there without even going through the process. At the same time, if they're actively recruiting, if someone quits, they already have two people on deck. They're not having to start that wheel for a 3 to 6 month process to get someone in the door. So proactively having people on deck is extremely, extremely important, but it's easier said than done. But the ones that do that don't skip a beat. And that's extremely important if you're trying to grow.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'd say that the worst spot you can be in is if you have to choose among the immediately available doctors in the immediate area, because inevitably you're going to run across the job hoppers or the unproductive doctors or the ones who just aren't going to share your vision.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into that good cultural fit and even good clinical fit. What are some of the green flags? If I'm an owner looking for a candidate, what are some of the green flags that I need to look for to ensure that they're a good fit?
Sure. And the easiest one is finding out what the candidate's 5-year plan is. Where do they see their career going, either clinically or from an ownership standpoint, or just in general, what is important to them, and does it line up with your position? It's easy to sugarcoat it, particularly if they're a great salesperson and can make a good pitch. But if you know that they want to be an owner in 5 years and you have no interest in offering any sort of equity, well, they're going to leave probably 4 or 5 years because they're going to start to get ready to and antsy to move into that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a big one. Knowing that your goals align. I would say it's also important to really nail down what is important to the culture of your office. And so if you're looking for someone who's growth oriented, talk through their CE. And if they've just taken the minimum at local conferences, then they might not have the interest or the bandwidth to really buy into that growth mentality that you're looking for. But if they've made the investment in themselves to improve themselves and become a better doctor, that's someone who may well align. And then also, if frankly, if they have an interest in the non-clinical aspects of the practice, if they want to hear about the morning meetings and morning huddles and community involvement and shared CE events, then they're seeing themselves as a member of the practice as opposed to it just being a job that they'll have temporarily until they move on to the next one. So those are all some good green flags to look for to feel comfortable that you're hiring someone who's going to be a true part of the team.
Good.
Yeah.
But when we can't talk about green flags without having red flags. So what are some of those? And Mark, I feel like you have something to add there.
No, I'll just add, to kind of echo what Morgan said about the green flags, and this is bringing the old recruiter out of me from 20 years ago. Just when I was hiring, you mentioned a few things, Morgan. I couldn't agree more with what I hear, working with doctors is someone that has like a leader or owner mindset. They don't necessarily want to maybe be the leader or owner, but like to your point, they're asking questions about the offices or the practices or the office managers, the team. Like they have a strong interest of everyone else because they want to make sure they fit in, and they also want to make sure you fit into their expectations environment. And I always love, seeing people that have proven the growth of themselves and want to continue to grow. You mentioned like continue education, things like that. Someone that has a history of, hey, I'd love to bring this procedure that I've noticed that you guys mentioned throughout this entire interview that you guys refer this out. Like I want to pick this up, in the next 12 months and maybe keep some of this in-house, or I have a different way of doing it. Let's work together and see if we can better this process or better this procedure. Would love to be a champion or leader in your business if hired, things like that. I love when candidates say things like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So they're
good.
looking at just beyond the job. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Sure, and that leads into the red flags portion, I guess.
Fair
And
enough.
I'm going to say this part, but I want to throw out a caveat that this may not necessarily be fair to some of the big city dentists where there's going to be job hopping, where people are putting together schedules that may include 3 different jobs in a given time frame.
Yeah.
A job hopping, that's a big one. If it's someone who hasn't been successful in a series of jobs, hasn't really found their clinical home, that could be an issue. Certainly talk through it because they may have reasons, but if it's always someone else's fault, that's maybe someone to avoid. So that's a big one. Uh, as far as other red flags, someone who maybe hasn't invested in themselves. So if they're doing the same procedures they did coming out of dental school and they're 5 years into it, don't expect them to suddenly start placing implants or doing molar endo. So make sure that aligns with what you need from them. Also, if someone's been out of school for a while, hasn't really settled into a permanent role in a position, that could be perfectly fine. But I find that doctors who have been out 5 years and haven't really settled into that role yet, there may be an issue for them. Either they can't, dedicate the kind of time they need to in order to be a true part of the practice, or maybe they don't adapt well. If finding someone who's going to adapt to your practice is important, it's probably best to shoot for someone early in their career who's still eager to learn and grow and adapt and modify themselves to be what the practice needs them to be.
That's fair. Something else came to mind on, something about your organization that can be attractive. How can practice owners use things like technology and modern office culture as a recruitment tool?
Sure. Well, the top 10% of candidates, the elite level of candidates, of dentists, they're going to look for practice environments that approach things the same way they do. And so aren't going to be settling for a run-of-the-mill practice. They want to see that the practice has good management in place. They're going to want to see that they've invested in the technology so they can provide excellent care, and that they'll have the tools they need to expand their skill sets. And so by really pitching the technology, you're showing that, hey, this is where our value is. This is where we position ourselves in the market. This is why we feel like we provide great level care. And that's going to appeal to that top level candidate. And without it, frankly, you're going to lose, the top quarter of the dentists out there who are going to see that you don't have the digital scanner or that you haven't invested in a cone beam and, move on to a practice that better aligns with that. So I think having the technology is just a key to the game, showing how you intend to use it and why you have the technology to improve patient care. That's going to be crucial in differentiating yourself in the market.
Go ahead,
Sorry,
Morgan.
I mean, to your point, Morgan, if they don't invest in the technology and keep up with what's going on around them, then sometimes the candidates will feel that they're not going to have the time or have the investment that you'll give them to grow and be part of that. So if you're not doing it with your equipment and your office, your staff and everything else, how are you going to really do that for me if I come in here and I want to be a leader here and I'm not given that same opportunity? You're giving it to the rest of everything else in your business. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
And I should throw one more point out there, and that I get this a lot with early career doctors who will look at technology as a sign for how well the practice is adapting to their current changes.
Mhm.
And there's a concern that they don't want to go into an office where the two partners have been there for 35 years, always approach things the same way, don't see a need to really invest and learn new things. And if they go in and become a partner there, are they going to have an impact and be able to modernize things and convince the other doctors to invest in upgrades? So frankly, will be probably hesitant to move forward into a situation like that.
Yeah, true. All right. So I want to look at this in terms of production or patient volume. If I'm the owner, when should I realistically start looking at the recruitment process for a new associate?
Sure. In a perfect world, I'd say what Mark said earlier is correct. Always stay networked, always meet the new doctors in the area, stay active in study clubs, and get kind of a backup pipeline going so you'll know who to call first if you have an opening. But that's not realistic in all cases, and you may not always have the perfect person in the neighborhood. And so timing is crucial, but is relevant to the location. And so in inner city practice or a inner suburban practice will have more options, and they can wait a little bit longer before starting the process. But as I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to need to at least budget 4 to 5 months to find a great doctor and not feel rushed. And even that may be a little bit too late. But the more remote you are, the more rural or even in some of the secondary markets, they're not likely to have a local dentist who's a match. Most of the local doctors in places like that are practice owners or are locked in. And so you're going to have to start accounting for relocation potentially. And that's going to add, 4 to 5 months to the process in some cases, so depending on the time of year that you start the search. Because sometimes rural areas can have an absolutely amazing opportunity, but they only have a window once a year when people are considering making changes over the summer because their contracts renewed or they finished programs or
Oh,
just the
yeah.
kids aren't in school. And so they need to account for that and don't expect to find someone right away.
Well, and it's a little bit of a trick question. It's like you said, you always have to be recruiting. It just always has to be in the back of your mind with like what Mark said and what you said with networking and working with people like you and using your expertise to make sure that you're ready for that next step. And you mentioned something about contracts a second ago. So I want to touch on that because I have time for one more question for you. What's the one thing that owners overlook in an associate contract that can lead to some turnover?
Sure, I would. I know you're asked for one. I'm going to give you two anyway. So I think one is kind of the over promising and under delivering aspect. Because if a potential associate dentist sees it in the contract, that's what they're expecting. And so if they're not getting the support from a dental team perspective, assistants and hygienists, number of new patients, then they're going to leave before the end of the contract or at the end of the contract. And the other part kind of plays into Mark's specialty here, and that there's a lot of positive assumptions and defaulting to honesty that both practice owners and potential associates make. But when push comes to shove, an associate can think that they're going to have a partnership option in 2 years, whereas the owner may think, well, 2 years under ideal circumstances, if they do X, Y, and Z, but X, Y, and Z aren't in the contract. So knowing what the triggers are to instigate partnership are important. Knowing the time frame, knowing the expectations of the administrative functions that go along with partnership, all those should be in a contract if partnership is the end result of the associate agreement. And Mark, I'm sure you can chime in with a more educated response than that.
Yeah, and sometimes I think for principal owners, it may be difficult, and I may not always recommend putting a timeline in the employment contract for partnership because there's a lot of things that could happen. At the same time, there's probably a lot of intangibles that if I was an owner, I would expect before making someone a partner because it's pretty much a business marriage if they're allowing them to buy in for a substantial amount at some point in time. So I want to make sure they have all these intangibles and not just the timeline and maybe not just a production number. Those are two good key indicators. But yes, I mean, for clients that I work through, that I go through in a partnership situation when engaged, we look through, like notice period, we go through non-solicitations and non-competes and stuff like that, depending on the state. They must be reasonable from a distance. But the one nice thing with partnerships, and this is positive for both I would say both the principal owner and even the soon-to-be partner, is that it's a bit stickier. And the reason I say that is you own part of a business. Non-solicits, non-competes are typically almost always enforceable in that case, depending on the situation and the dollar amount and the percentage and things like that. Whereas employment contracts, as we all know, the state of California, it's not enforceable for non-competes and things like that. And if things change, having partnership is a bit stickier for all. It's a place to call home for both the principal partner and have partners along the way, as well as the new partners coming in. And then also just need to make sure, there's a lot of different things that go into it. And obviously, if you become a partner, you sign an operating agreement. Well, that's kind of the the document that says this happens at this point in time, and then if you do this, this is what this happens. If you get this offer, this is who's all involved, and it pretty much lays out everything. I mean, I could spend 30 minutes just kind of talking about that document, but won't do that here. But it's extremely important that your contracts spell everything out and lay everything out, because it is pretty much like you said, laying everything out so everyone's on the same page. So everyone's aligned. And I think the right word there to use is aligned, because if you're both aligned, you're both going to be happy and moving forward in the same direction. If not aligned, or they don't, actions don't match what's written down in the contract, that's when things go sideways.
Yeah, alignment, really at the end of the day, that covers everything that we talked about today and a lot more. And thank you both so much for sharing your expertise. Morgan, thanks for coming on the show with us today. We appreciate you. What's the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, I mentioned we have a big team, so the best way is to go to etsdental.com, and you'll see a list of the recruiters in the office that cover different geographic areas or different specialties depending on what you're looking for, and just reach out to the right one, and they'll be happy to take it from there.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. To our audience, if you'd like to connect with today's guest, Morgan Pace, go ahead and reach out to him. I'll include his contact in the show notes. And if you'd like to schedule some time to learn about any of our Polaris services, or maybe there's a topic that we haven't covered that you'd like to hear about, you can send us an email to info@polarishealthcarepartners.com, or you can reach us by visiting our website at polarishealthcarepartners.com. Thanks so much for being a loyal listener and subscriber. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend or a colleague, and be sure to leave us a rating on your favorite podcast platform, including YouTube, where you can also now find videos of your favorite episodes. We'll see you on the next episode of the Group Practice Accelerator Podcast.